everyone. This is Todd Kirkpatrick, and welcome to another edition of Tape 5 for Safety. And in this video, we're going to be discussing confined spaces. But first, some fatal facts. About 1.6 million Americans enter confined spaces every year. And unfortunately, there are about 90 deaths that occur every year with confined space work. Of those, 40% are would-be rescuers, and 79% of confined space fatalities are due to hazardous atmospheres. So let's think about these last two bullets for a moment. 40% were would-be rescuers. So what this tells us is that proper planning for the confined spaces were probably not implemented, especially with the function of having rescue available. 79% of confined space fatalities are due to hazardous atmospheres. Well, you can probably already guess what this means is that proper monitoring was not conducted, or probably not conducted continuously while employees were in the confined space. So what are some examples of confined spaces? Well, there's many out there, and many on our job sites, and such as these pictures indicates, things like tanks, manholes, vaults, pipes. You name it, there's many that can be talked about, but the key is that every confined space is different, and every confined space must be evaluated separately. So, how do we determine a confined space? First of all, well, there's a 3-point test that we can ask to determine if a space is a confined space or not. First, is the space large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter the space and perform assigned work? Does the space have limited or restricted means of entry or exit? And the space is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. So once we determine it's a confined space, the next thing we need to do is to determine if it's a permit required confined space. And this is typically a 4-point test that we want to ask, and to be a permit required confined space, it only needs to meet one of these criteria. First being, does it contain or have a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere? Does it contain a material that could potentially engulf an entrant? And is the space have an internal configuration such that an entrant could become trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls, or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section? Or does the space contain any other recognized serious safety or health hazard? And again, it only needs to be one of these to be a permit required space. And another important part here is that permits can only be issued by the McKinney Safety Department. So it's important that you get the safety department involved with all your confined space entries. So why are confined spaces dangerous? Well, there's many reasons, but first is that the hazards are not always obvious within confined spaces. Confined spaces have a lack of ventilation, and it can be difficult for employees to exit, and also difficult for rescue teams to enter. So very important to keep these facts in mind. Pre-entry testing requires sampling from outside the space. And one thing to mention is that all confined spaces must be tested before entry. That's very important. And we always want to make sure that we're using instruments that have a sampling tube or sampling probe that we can put into the space, so we can avoid lowering the monitor itself into the space. And when we test the atmosphere, we want to test in this order. First, for oxygen. Within the space, the oxygen needs to be between 19.5% and 23.5%. We also want to check for combustible gases and vapors, and 10% of their lower flammable limit. And we also want to check for toxic gases, most common being carbon monoxide. And we also want to check for any other hazardous substance in the space. The confined space team is very important through the planning for the entry of the confined space, and the team members are authorized entrance into the space, attendants of the space, and these are typically our watchdogs of our confined spaces. We have our entry supervisor, that's typically the competent person over all the operations of the confined space. And then depending on the type of rescue we have, we may have emergency and rescue services standing by. So it's important that we always have these team members involved within the planning of a confined space. All members must be trained to their specific duty and trained to the space itself, and this is very important within the planning. So rescue procedures are that all confined spaces must have a rescue plan established regardless of the type of space that it is. This can involve self-rescue, non-entry rescue, and entry rescue, which does require specialized training, as we mentioned before. And entry rescue will require pre-notification to rescue service providers. So this means that we're going to have to get these folks involved through your planning process. Rescue personnel into a confined space, again, must be trained and familiar with the space. So with this bit of information, where are your confined space hazards? Think about these hazards and how they could affect your task and your livelihood. The importance of proper planning for confined space entry cannot be stressed enough. So please, always plan, prepare, and prevent. And from all of us at the safety team at McKinney's, this is Todd Kirkpatrick. Thanks for watching.